This video is a brief introduction to pandas. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about the different features of pandas, but I do want to give you just an initial view, and we'll execute a few units of code just to get you started thinking about pandas and what it is and what we're doing here. We'll begin with the pandas documentation. Pandas is a huge module. It is a module that was written originally by a hedge fund manager who wanted to be able to do, or maybe he was a quant, that's more likely, that is the person who quantitatively analyzes the markets and when to trade and that kind of thing. It's designed to be able to manipulate tabular data in very useful ways. In some ways, we can think of pandas as similar to Excel. Excel does really a lot of what pandas does, and pandas does a lot of what Excel does. Pandas goes a little further. It adds in certain features and functions that you might find in a relational database. The ability to work with multiple spreadsheets, as it were, we call them data frames, to merge them, to join them, to be able to select from them and concatenate them, and then to do all kinds of complex calculations on the data within the spreadsheet, which we call a data frame, as I said. That is the purpose of pandas. I would, if you were interested, if I were you and I was interested in learning a lot about pandas, I would begin by bookmarking the documentation. It's very well written, in my opinion, and it can be a good way to try to get a handle on this. But we need to acknowledge that pandas is so big that it will take time to really get a handle on all of its different features. Pandas is very unlike Python itself in that it allows you to do the same thing in many multiple different kinds of ways. It tries to give you every possible convenient way to do a particular operation. Whereas Python, one of the Python aphorisms is there should be only one clear way to do it. That's definitely not the pandas philosophy. So one of the ways we can kind of get started in pandas is we can go through some of the guides, like the tutorials. For instance, the Getting Started guide allows you to work with, let's say, some tutorials, and it will introduce pandas in hopefully a descriptive and understandable way. And there's a lot of different kind of ways you can approach this. One of them would be to read these tutorials. I have not read these tutorials myself. I'm actually thinking of maybe doing it pretty soon, just because when I learned pandas for the first time, it was just by trying to do things with it, and that was a really nasty introduction, mostly because there's so many different ways to do things and you get very confused. However, there are going to be three main ways that you learn pandas. One is you're going to be using documentation. One is you're going to be trying to solve problems. And the third is you'll be reading tutorials. So the tutorials are one way to go. But the other really big resource is the user guide with its 10 Minutes to Pandas guide, which demonstrates a lot of what pandas does. So this is another resource that I recommend in getting started with pandas. You've got your tutorials, your documentation, and now let's do a couple of exercises and just get used to understanding what are the main object types that we're going to work with Python and pandas, and what does this mean to you and me. I'm going to go now to the in-class exercises 08 notebook. Hopefully at the time that you're watching this, it's still in class 8. It may be a different number. It's possible that at some point in the future I'll be reorganizing this class. Right now it's February 2021. But in any case, hopefully you'll find something similar to this, or you can just watch watch and learn, as they say. We begin with the data frame. The data frame is the workhorse structure in pandas Workhorse meaning the central structure that we use most of the time. Of course, in Python, we have things like lists and dictionaries and lists of lists and this, which is a dictionary of lists. But the data frame is a special structure all its own that is unique to Pandas. It's also a known entity within another language called R, which does very similar work to Pandas. In fact, it's arguable that Pandas is based on the language R. The data frame represents what we can call a spreadsheet, a table of columns and rows that have column labels and row labels. This data frame will be the primary structure that we work with in Pandas. That and the other two main structures, the series and the index, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But this data frame of columns and rows, by the way, when we print the data frame, it looks like this. And when you work with it in PyCharm or in your py files, you'll find that your output looks like this. You have to print your data frame. The Jupyter Notebook, however, has a special advantage in that if you ask Jupyter to show you a data frame, it will display it in a very comely format, nice pretty format here with columns and rows very clearly highlighted and a nice JavaScript row highlighter. So that's the difference between just referencing the data frame here or printing it. Printing it, as I said, it will look like we just saw in your py files, or if you choose to print it. But if you just say df at the end, you should see this nice format. It's the same thing, of course. Now, the data frame structure is one of columns and rows, as I mentioned. And what we're going to be looking at as we begin to explore this data frame, especially when we get together for class, will be in how we can manipulate this structure usefully in many different ways. You want to think of the data frame as being eminently accessible in terms of rows and columns, where you're going to be using these row labels and column labels, and that we can process and do lots and lots of different interesting things using these columns and rows. We'll also use the columns and rows to work with multiple data frames that we might have retrieved from different sources, and we will use those column and row labels to concatenate them together, to merge them, etc. So the columns and row labels mean a great deal to us because they are how we can access different values within the data frame. The other main structure, or the two other main structures that we want to discuss, and since we were just talking about column and row labels, why don't we take a look at the index for the data frame? I'm going to print the data frame first so we can see it, and then I'll show you the index. Or maybe it would be better to do the reverse. Let's try that. I'll print the index. And then just below it, I'm going to put the data frames just so we can see, we can still visualize where it came from. Okay, so when we look at an index that has consecutive numbers, we're going to see an object called a range index. Now this starts to get a little bit confusing. Let me show you what the columns look like. If I look at the columns for a data frame, I see an index with ABC. Now, what this is a special object called an index object. The index object shows us column or row labels. What we saw before with the 0, 1, 2 index called a range index, that's sort of like a type of index. It's a subset of index or a more specialized index. But basically what we're trying to get across is we've now looked at two of the main structures in Python. The first two are the data frame, which is like a spreadsheet, columns and rows, and then the index, which holds column or row indices. The left side index does not need to be a range index. It depends on what we'd like it to be. We could even reset the index to something else. And if we do that, we then see that it's still, why is it still saying it's a range index? Oh, because I need to say that IDX. See, this is the quirk I mentioned before. It's saying range index Y because that's the last value that IDX had. And even though IDX disappeared, it's still remembered by the notebook. This kind of thing can drive you absolutely bonkers. So we're going to want to be real careful with it. Okay, now we have an index that says X, Y, and Z. And this is the second major structure that we want to look at. It represents as an object that represents the column and row labels. Now, we're not going to learn a lot about the index except how to manipulate it in different ways, and that's actually quite a lot. We're not going to be looking, I don't think, at a lot of index methods, but understand that this is a special kind of object. It's an object that represents the columns or row labels, and it's one of the three main structures that we're going to be working with. The last main structure that I want to show you is the series. So I think I'll just keep going here. That should be all right. And a series is a column or row from a data frame. Or maybe a standalone array of values. We could call it a list of values. It's not a list. It's a vector of values. It's a series. A series is an object of itself. Let me show you what an object series looks like. Let's say I say df, what was in our data frame? Let's say df.a. That should get us a series object. And if I print the series object, I'll see first the series. Let's stop printing the index so it's a little clearer. I'll see the series object, and I'll see, and I'm looking at the data frame with it. This series object, which is built out of the column that we got from the data frame, is again its own special object. It's very similar to a list because it is a sequence of values. As you can see, 1, 2, 3, that came from the A column. I could go to the B column, and I should see these floats. 2.9, 3.5, 4.9. But look at the whole of the series when we print it out. This series actually consists of more than just a series of values, although that's its main purpose. It also contains an index. So it pulls the index from the data frame from which it was extracted, and it also has its own its own index. This would also be true if we wanted to pull a series from a row. We could do that just as easily. We would do that using something called loc, and we could give it an X, and we can look at that series. That series, as you can see, gives us a cross-section of the data frame. It's 1, 2.9 in your store. See that? And look, the index of the series is now the column labels. So I hope you're beginning to see that what we're looking at is all about a data frame, and it's understanding whether we're working with column labels or row labels, that we can understand what a series is supposed to look like. And also to understand that a series and a data frame, they both make use of the index. If I was to look at the S2 index, can you guess what we would see? We should see an index object with A, B, and C, because the index of the series is A, B, and C. So you see these three structures, the data frame, the series, and the index, they all come together to build out a spreadsheet or this special series object that, is sort of list-like. We're going to learn a lot more about how these work, how the data frame can be used to manipulate the data within it, and the same thing being true of the series, how we can work with series and data frames together. We're also going to learn about the nature of these things. What's interesting about both a series and a data frame is that they're list-like, but they're also dictionary-like. They're list-like and dict-like. For example, with the series, I can say S20. I don't know if you can imagine what I would get. If I have a sequence of values that are 1, 2.9, and Yorster, what would S20 give me? What would make sense to see there for S20? This series. Probably a 1, right? But what if I were, let's go back to printing the series. But what if I were to take advantage of the dict-like aspect of a series? What if I were to say S2.A or S2 subscript A? I should also get 1 from that. And that's because the series is dict-like and it's also list-like. That's also true of the data frame. You're going to find that with a data frame, let's make a data frame here. We'll work with this data frame. You're going to find that a data frame can be used to select columns or rows. If I say DFA, for example, I'm going to get the column A. But if I were to say DFILOC, let's say I'll say all and A, I should see just the, here I'm going to print this and then show it. I should see, whoops, I should see just the A column from the data frame. I'm going to show the A column series and the data frame. I made a mistake. That'll happen from time to time. The point that I wanted to make, though, let's look at this data frame again, is that a data frame can be list-like and it can also be dict-like. So, you know, again, I can say DFA, I could say DF A and B, and I'll see just those columns. I can say, this will give me back a new data frame with just the A-B columns, and that's a little like a data frame, a dictionary. But at the same time, I could also say DF0 to 1 or 2, let's say, and get the first 2 rows of the data frame. So here you say I've selected the first 2 rows of the data frame. This can get confusing really, really fast, and the syntaxes can be very confusing since they're very strange. For instance, since there's multiple ways to do things, it can also be extremely confusing. For example, look, I can use df.loc xy to get those 2 rows. I could also use df.iloc with 0, 2 to get those rows. I could also use df.loc with x 2y to get those rows. I'm not trying to confuse you here, but I want to warn you. It can be a bit confusing at first to disambiguate the different syntaxes that are possible with data frames and with series and with indexes. There are so many methods, so many different ways to do things within Pandas that it can be a bit overwhelming at first, especially if you're trying to learn this to become an expert. I spent a number of semesters, every semester, sitting down with Pandas afresh, trying to understand and get my arms around the entire library. And I found that it's very, very challenging to do that. Of course, it's more than just using the features, it's how you apply them. But I spent a long time just trying to understand the features, and I found that this library is so big, it has so many features, and within those features, so many different options and ways to configure your function calls and method calls, that I became very overwhelmed for a long time. It was only after repeated study and coming back to it over and over again that I was able to become comfortable with the most basic things that we can do in Pandas. And I'm hoping, if you're interested in learning this, that you'll be able to first start with, you know, our material, but then branch off and continue to learn in whatever way you can to learn as much as you can about this library, if this is something you think that can be useful in your life, your professional life. I use it from time to time, even in my personal life, not that often, but occasionally. But if you work within finance or if you work within any job that uses Excel, you're going to find that Pandas can be made an indispensable part of your toolkit, your Python toolkit. Pandas is responsible for Python really getting juiced in popularity over the last few years, and that's mostly due to the finance industry. But I got introduced to using Pandas on the job at just a business analysis department within our large company. The managers and executives of the company wanted to see very recent data analyzed and visualized so that they can make intelligent decisions of the company. And there was a lot of data to work with on sales. It was an ad sales company, which of course has massive amounts of data. That data was managed and analyzed and visualized using Pandas. And so if you're in any job that makes extensive use of Excel or even moderate use of Excel, Pandas can be a wonderful replacement for Excel. So in class, we'll start to look at specific features and go deeper into it. But I wanted to begin with just a quick introduction that will hopefully get you used to the ideas of the data frame, the series, and the index so that you can hit the ground running when we get started in earnest.